The challenge, no longer against one king.
Rise, great Baal.
The sky over Israel did not close all at once. It happened slowly, like a door being pushed shut by an invisible hand, while farmers still looked upward each morning expecting mercy, while priests of Baal still promised rain, while a nation that once remembered the God of its fathers began to forget the sound of his name. In the royal cities, smoke rose from foreign altars, and the smell of incense drifted through streets where covenant songs had grown quiet. Men who once taught the law hid their faces. Families whispered instead of prayed, and the soil itself seemed to wait for someone brave enough to say what everyone feared was true. Israel had traded the living God for gods that could not breathe. At the center of this change stood power dressed as devotion. King Ahab ruled from his throne, but the religious heart of the kingdom was being reshaped by Jezebel, a queen of iron, while bringing with her the worship of Baal from the Phoenician world and pressing it into Israel not as a private belief but as a national command. Baal was praised as the lord of storm fertility, and rain the one who made the fields swell with grain, and the wombs of animals bring forth life. That detail matters because the judgment about to fall would strike Baal at the exact point where his followers claimed he was strongest. And when heaven went silent, the silence itself would become an argument. Then without ceremony, a man from Tishbe in Gilead stepped out of obscurity. Elijah did not come from the polished world of scribes' palaces or royal courts. He came from the rough eastern country, from hills and ravines, from a landscape where men learned endurance from stone thirst, heat, and wind. There was nothing soft about him. His clothing was simple, his body weathered by sun, his presence severe, yet there was something in him more dangerous than anger's certainty. He spoke like a man who had stood before a greater throne before daring to enter the throne room of Israel. When Elijah came before Ahab, he did not flatter the king or bow to the mood of the court. The guards may have expected pleading negotiation, perhaps some cautious religious warning, but Elijah brought none of that. He stood before royal power and announced, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." The word struck the room harder than a sword. No rain meant no harvest meant hunger, and hunger meant the slow unraveling of villages, trade animals, families, and royal confidence. Elijah had not merely challenged a king, he had challenged an entire religious system in the name of the God Israel had abandoned. Ahab's face hardened, and somewhere behind the machinery of the palace, Jezebel's anger began to burn. But before the court could decide whether this desert prophet was mad dangerous, or both, Elijah vanished from public sight. The man who had just shaken the kingdom was sent not to gather followers, not to build a movement, but to disappear. God led him east of the Jordan to the brook Cherith, a hidden stream among stones and ravines far from the noise of the palace. There, with no crowd to admire him and no altar fire to vindicate him, Elijah would learn the first secret of his calling. A prophet who confronts kings must first be sustained in silence. At Cherith, the world became small water over stones, rough ground beneath his feet, the heat of the day, the cold of night, and the long, quiet hours where nothing moved except the stream. Elijah had spoken a word that would shake nations, yet now his survival depended on something as humble as a brook that no king could see. Morning came, and with it an impossible sound. Wings cut through the air. Dark shapes dropped toward the ravine, and ravens settled near the prophet with food in their beaks. These were not clean temple birds, not symbols of purity, not creatures any priest would have chosen for holy service, and yet God made them messengers of provision. Bread and meat arrived where no kitchen existed, where no friend could reach him, where no human plan could explain it. Elijah ate in silence, and every meal carried a lesson deeper than hunger. The God who can close the heavens can also feed his servant through the most unlikely means. But the brook had its own sermon to preach. Day after day, its voice grew thinner, the water slipping lower between the stones, until the place of provision began to look like a place of loss. Elijah could not pretend the drought was only a message for others. He felt it under his own hand in the drying stream beside him. That is where faith becomes less theatrical and more costly. It is one thing to announce judgment in a palace. It is another to drink from a shrinking brook and keep trusting the same God who sent you there. Cherith was not failure, but it was temporary, and temporary places often feel permanent when they begin to dry. Then the water stopped. No rushing sound, no glimmering thread in the morning light, only stones that had once been covered. At that moment, God spoke again, and the next command must have sounded almost stranger than the ravens Elijah was to leave Israel and go towards Zarephath in the region of Sidon. Sidon was not neutral ground. It was the world from which Jezebel had come, the cultural doorway through which Baal worship had entered Israel's royal house. God was sending his prophet into the territory associated with the very corruption he had opposed, and the person chosen to receive him was not a ruler, a warrior, or a wealthy patron. She was a widow. In the ancient world, widowhood often meant exposure, no husband's protection, uncertain income, fragile standing, and a future that could collapse with one failed harvest. During famine, people with full storehouses grew anxious. A widow with a child stood at the edge of disappearance. Elijah found her near the entrance of the town gathering sticks. Not logs for a feast, not bundles for many days, only a few pieces of dry wood for one final fire. Her life had narrowed to a handful of flour, a little oil, a son she could not save by strength alone, and a last meal she had already accepted as the end. When Elijah asked for water and bread, he was not testing a comfortable woman's generosity. He was standing inside the rawest human moment, a mother measuring hunger against obedience, survival against trust, visible emptiness against a word she had not expected to hear. And the next sentence would decide whether her house became a place of death or a hidden sanctuary of daily miracle. Elijah said to her, "Do not be afraid," and those words did not erase the famine, but they opened a door inside it. He told her to make a small cake for him first, then food for herself and her son, because the Lord, the God of Israel, had declared that the flour would not be spent and the oil would not run dry until rain returned to the land. The widow stood between two kinds of reality. One was in her hands, a nearly empty jar, a little oil dry sticks, a hungry child. The other was in the prophet's mouth, a promise from a God she did not yet fully know, asking her to act before the evidence appeared. Faith in that moment did not look like singing, shouting, or certainty. It looked like tired hands kneading the last flour, pouring the last oil, lighting the last fire, and giving away what seemed impossible to spare. The miracle began quietly, not with thunder from heaven, but with obedience inside a poor woman's house. The next day, the jar still held flour. The jug still gave oil. Not mountains of grain, not overflowing luxury, but enough for another meal, enough for one more sunrise, enough to prove that God's provision often comes daily because daily dependence keeps the heart awake. Outside, the drought kept tightening its grip. Fields cracked open, animals, weakened merchants raised prices, and families counted what remained with fear in their throats. Yet inside that small house in Zarephath, bread kept appearing as if heaven had hidden a spring beneath the floor. But provision is not the end of faith's testing. One day the widow's son grew sick, and the room that had smelled of bread began to smell of panic sweat and grief. His breath weakened, his body became still, and the miracle house suddenly felt like a tomb. The mother's cry rose with a terrible honesty. She asked Elijah whether his presence had brought her sin to remembrance and her son to death. It was the kind of question pain asks when faith has not disappeared, but has been wounded too deeply to speak politely. Elijah did not explain suffering as if grief could be solved with a sentence. He took the child from her arms, carried him upstairs, laid him on his own bed, and cried out to the Lord with the urgency of a man who knew that only God could answer this room. He stretched himself over the child and prayed again and again, pleading for life to return. There was no crowd, no mountain, no contest, no watching nation, only a dead boy, a grieving mother below, and a prophet pressing his whole soul against the silence. Then breath came back. The child's chest rose, life entered where death had settled, and Elijah carried him down into his mother's arms. Her confession was no longer borrowed from rumor or tradition. Now she knew that the word of the Lord in Elijah's mouth was true. By the time Elijah left Zarephath, his ministry had already passed through 3 hidden furnaces. He had watched ravens become servants, a poor widow become a vessel of provision, and a dead child breathe again. Before he ever stood on Carmel, God had taught him that public fire is born from private dependence. 3 years dragged across Israel like a punishment too heavy to name. The earth split into hard plates beneath the sun wells sank into mud, and the sound of livestock fading in the fields became part of daily life. Still, the priests of Baal had no rain to offer, only rituals, excuses, and louder prayers. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah again, "Show yourself to Ahab, and rain would come." The hidden prophet was called back into the open, and the same feet that had walked ravines and foreign roads now turned toward the palace. The silence was ending, but not gently. When Ahab saw him, he did what guilty power often does. He blamed the one who named the wound. "Is that you, troubler of Israel?" But Elijah's answer cut through the accusation. It was not the prophet who had troubled the nation, but the king and his house, because they had abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed Baal. The conflict could no longer remain behind walls. Elijah commanded Ahab to gather Israel on Mount Carmel, along with the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table. It would not be a private debate between religious ideas. It would be a public exposure of what the nation had become. Mount Carmel rose between land and sea, a place where the horizon seemed wide enough for heaven itself to answer. People came from villages, dry fields, and hungry homes, climbing with dust on their feet and uncertainty in their hearts. Some came hoping for rain, others for spectacle, and many because they no longer knew what they believed. The prophets of Baal arrived not as defeated men, but as representatives of a royal religion. Their garments, numbers, and confidence made Elijah look almost absurd by comparison. Hundreds stood on one side with institutional power behind them. On the other side stood one man with a rough mantle and an unseen God. Elijah spoke to the people first because the deepest sickness of Israel was not merely idolatry, but divided loyalty. "How long will you limp between two opinions?" he asked. "If the Lord was God, they must follow him. If Baal was God, they must follow Baal." The crowd answered with silence. That silence revealed more than any argument could have. It showed a people who wanted covenant blessing without covenant faithfulness, rain from heaven without surrender, and a safe distance from whichever side might lose. So Elijah set the test where Baal's reputation should have been strongest. 2 sacrifices would be prepared, but no human hand would light the fire. The God who answered by fire would be recognized as God, and before the day ended, the mountain would show whether Israel had been worshiping power or only emptiness dressed in power. The prophets of Baal began early, calling upon their God with voices full of confidence. Around the altar they moved in circles, feet striking the ground, arms lifted, bodies bending into rhythm as if intensity itself could force heaven to respond. But the morning passed, and the sacrifice remained untouched. The sun climbed higher, turning the stones hot beneath their feet. Their prayers became louder, their movements more frantic, their faces strained by desperation. Yet no flame came down, no cloud gathered, no voice broke the sky, and the silence around Baal grew heavier than any answer. By noon, Elijah spoke with sharp irony, not to entertain the crowd, but to expose the absurdity of trusting a God who needed human noise to awaken him. Perhaps Baal was deep in thought or traveling or asleep. The words landed like a blade because mockery is most dangerous when it reveals what everyone has begun to suspect. Afternoon faded toward evening and still nothing happened. No voice, no fire, no answer. The altar of Baal stood as a monument to emptiness, and the people who had stayed silent now had to face a terrifying possibility. Perhaps the God they feared was not alive at all. Then Elijah called the people near. He did not begin with spectacle, but with repair. Stone by stone, he rebuilt the broken altar of the Lord, using 12 stones for the 12 tribes of Israel, as if the very shape of the altar was preaching that the nation's division had not erased God's covenant memory. He arranged the wood placed to sacrifice, and then did something no one expected in a land dying of thirst. He asked for water. Again and again it was poured over the altar, soaking the offering, the wood, the stones, and filling the trench until every human explanation had been drowned. Elijah was removing every suspicion of trickery. No hidden coal, no dry tinder, no clever manipulation could survive that much water. If fire came now, it would not belong to technique theater or religious performance. It would belong to God alone. Then at the time of the evening offering, Elijah prayed. His prayer was not long, not frantic, not decorated with desperation. He called upon the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, asking that the people would know the Lord was God, that Elijah was his servant, and that God was turning their hearts back again. The answer came before the crowd had time to protect itself from wonder. Fire fell from the Lord, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench. The mountain that had listened to empty shouting all day now trembled beneath a single prayer, and Israel fell on its face crying, "The Lord, He is God." The fire on Carmel did not leave the nation neutral. Once truth had fallen from heaven, the prophets of Baal could no longer stand as harmless religious figures. They were seen as the men who had led Israel into covenant betrayal. Elijah ordered them seized, and judgment came at the brook Kishon, a severe act that belonged to the world of ancient covenant law, where idolatry was not treated as private preference, but as treason against the living God. Yet Elijah did not remain on the mountain celebrating victory. He climbed away from the crowd, bowed low to the ground, and prayed again. The fire had exposed the truth, but the land was still thirsty, and the prophet understood that judgment without restoration would leave the people with ashes, but no life. 7 times he sent his servant to look toward the sea. 6 times the answer returned the same nothing. But Elijah stayed bowed in prayer, because faith is often forced to stand between a promise already spoken and a horizon that still looks empty. On the 7th time, the servant saw a cloud as small as a man's hand rising from the sea. To anyone else, it was almost nothing, barely worth mentioning. To Elijah, it was the first visible crack in 3 years of silence. Soon the wind shifted, clouds thickened, and the sky that had been sealed began to darken with mercy. Rain fell hard over the land, striking dust stones, roofs, fields, faces, and empty vessels. What began as a small cloud became a flood of restoration, and Israel heard the sound it had forgotten, water returning to a dying earth. Strength came upon Elijah, and he ran before Ahab's chariot toward Jezreel. His feet cut through wet ground, his mantle struck against him, and his heart must have carried something close to hope. After fire, confession, judgment, and rain, perhaps the nation would finally turn. But miracles do not automatically change hardened hearts. When Ahab told Jezebel what had happened on Carmel, she did not tremble before the fire of God. Her anger became colder, sharper, and more personal, and she sent Elijah a message promising that by the next day, his life would be taken like the prophets he had judged. The words reached Elijah after the greatest public victory of his life. And then the strange collapse came. The man who had faced a king, mocked Baal, prayed down fire, and outrun a chariot now ran for his life, because even prophets are still men, and exhaustion can speak with a voice that sounds stronger than faith. God answered him not with a lecture, but with bread, water, sleep, and a gentle touch. An angel woke him, fed him, let him rest, and fed him again because the journey ahead was too much for him. Before God explained anything to Elijah, he restored his body, and that small mercy may be one of the most human moments in the entire story. Strengthened by that wilderness mercy, Elijah walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. This was not merely a journey across land, but a journey backward into Israel's deepest memory toward the place where covenant fire law, fear, and divine presence had once marked a people forever. He entered a cave carrying more than physical exhaustion. He carried disappointment, loneliness, and the terrible thought that all his obedience had changed nothing. Then the voice of the Lord came to him, not as accusation, but as invitation. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah answered from the wound inside him. He had been zealous for the Lord, yet Israel had broken the covenant, torn down the altars, killed the prophets, and now sought his life. In his pain, he believed he was the last faithful voice left alive. Then came the wind, tearing across the mountain with such force that rocks split, and the landscape seemed to shudder beneath invisible hands. But the Lord was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, the ground itself convulsing, yet the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came fire, fierce and consuming, the kind of sign Elijah knew well from Carmel. But the Lord was not in the fire. And then, after all the violence of nature had passed there, came a thin silence, a low whisper, a presence so gentle that it could be missed by anyone addicted only to spectacle. Elijah covered his face with his mantle. He had seen God answer with fire, but now he learned that divine power is not limited to what overwhelms the eye. Sometimes the deepest work of God comes quietly, not breaking the mountain, but reaching the exhausted heart. The Lord did not flatter Elijah's despair, but he did answer it. Elijah was not alone. 7,000 in Israel had not bowed to Baal. Hidden faithfulness still existed beneath the surface of a corrupted nation, and the prophet's story was larger than what his sorrow could see. God also gave him work beyond confrontation. Kings would be anointed, judgment would continue, and another prophet would be raised up, Elisha, son of Shaphat. Elijah had asked for an ending, but God gave him continuity, proving that the mission did not depend on one man's strength. Elijah found Elisha plowing in the field, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of labor oxen breathing soil, turning wooden yokes creaking under the sun. Without a long speech, Elijah cast his mantle upon him. Elisha understood the weight of that gesture left. The plow burned the tools of his former life, fed the people, and followed. When the final day came, Elijah and Elisha crossed the Jordan together, and Elijah's mantle struck the water as if the old stories were opening again. Then a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated them, and Elijah was taken up in a whirlwind, leaving no tomb behind, only the fallen mantle. Elisha picked it up, struck the Jordan, and the waters parted because the fire had not ended with Elijah. It had passed into another life, reminding every generation that God's work is never buried with his servants.